Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the channel. I'm Kris. This is part 2, Andrew Jackson and the 8-Year Reign of Terror documentary. This is by the People Profiles. Sorry. Click on that thumbs up. Subscribe to the channel. Look. Click. Click. That's how easy it is. You can donate to the channel through the thanks button, request a video, and your name sponsors that video. The reason why I'm doing this, as I said in the last video, is because this Saturday I will be taking a trip to the Hermitage. And there you go. The last video was like 40 minutes. I apologize. So I'll try to make this a little bit shorter. I can't promise anything. I have a drink. I got some popcorn. Let's get into it. Maybe that'll shut me up.
While Jackson prepared his militiamen for war, in 1812, President Madison issued a call for an army of 50,000 volunteers. In the early 1810s, the United States was facing war not only with the British, but the indigenous tribes to the west as well. For several years, the Shawnee chief Tecumseh was in the process of uniting the Native American tribes around the Great Lakes into a multi-tribe Native American confederacy, which prepared to take part in an armed confrontation with the United States. The prospect of a large body of native warriors bearing down on Tennessee was an alarming one for Jackson. More immediately, a band of Creek Indians attacked 6 American settlers, prompting Jackson to mount a campaign of retribution. Then, in November 1811, while Tecumseh was away recruiting allies, General William Henry Harrison of Indiana preemptively struck at the heart of his confederacy by defeating a Native American force at Tippecanoe in November 1811. In response, Tecumseh allied with the British as what would become known as the War of 1812 broke out between the US and Britain in the summer of 1812 after years of escalating tensions. With the outbreak of war, 3,000 men volunteered for Jackson's Tennessee militia, and he was given orders by the War Department to go to New Orleans to defend against a potential attack. Owing to difficulties supplying his men, Jackson did not get going until early 1813. When they reached Natchez in mid-February, Jackson received an order from James Wilkinson to wait, as the British threat had not yet materialized. Not long afterwards, he received an order from Secretary of War John Armstrong to disband his militia and surrender the arms to Wilkinson, which would have left them vulnerable to Native American attacks on the return journey to Nashville. Jackson therefore defied orders and marched his men back to Nashville, earning himself the nickname Old Hickory for his toughness and endurance. That summer, Jackson narrowly avoided death again when he was involved in another shootout after a dispute with his aide Thomas Hart Benton and his brother Jesse. While Jackson spent weeks recuperating from the wound in his left shoulder, a brutal civil war was being fought among the Creek Indians after a faction known as the Red Sticks, a group inspired by Tecumseh to wage war not only against the whites but against their fellow tribesmen who were more accommodative towards the white population, began attacking their fellow Creek tribesmen. In late August of 1813, the Red Sticks massacred hundreds of American settlers at Fort Mims in Alabama, prompting President Madison to call out the Tennessee militia in September.
If you're in Alabama, and it looked like it froze on me. If you're in Alabama, Fort Mims is the top of the bay. Why is it not coming to me now? Mobile Bay. Mobile? Mobile's the city. It's like north east of that. But yeah, I never went there. I wanted to. It's not a very big thing. They do reenactments, I think, once a year. But it was something ridiculous. Like 800 people were in there, men, women, and children, and they attacked. And I want to say it was like 15 people made it out. 15 people lived. Like they just slaughtered everyone. And as soon as they did that, Jackson was like, nope, we're going back down.
After bringing together 2,500 men at Fayetteville in October of 1813, Jackson set off in pursuit of the Red Sticks. On the 3rd of November, his cavalry, under General John Coffee, sacked the Creek town of Tallahatchie, after which Jackson sent an orphaned Native American boy to Rachel to raise as a son alongside his nephew Andrew Jackson Jr., whom they adopted in 1808. Less than a week later, he came to the aid of the friendly White Sticks at Talladega, where they encircled 700 Red Sticks and destroyed half their force. Jackson's success in the South was accompanied by news of Tecumseh's defeat and death at the Battle of the Thames on the 5th of October 1813. The death of the Native American leader caused his Confederacy to break up. On the 27th of March 1814, Jackson's army of 2,000 men attacked the Red Sticks in their fortified camp at Horseshoe Bend near the Tallapoosa River. While the Tennesseans launched a frontal assault, Jackson's cavalry and his Cherokee and White Stick allies attacked from the rear, capturing the camp and killing most of the 1,000 Red Stick warriors before building a fort of their own, which they named Fort Jackson. A few weeks later, Jackson received the surrender of William Weatherford, the mixed-race chief of the Red Sticks. In June 1814,
Weatherford showed up in his camp, just walked in, announced who he was, and he was there to talk, and they knew who he was. And Jackson welcomed him in, and the guy basically said, I don't want to fight you anymore. I'm the last of my people. Like I have nothing. You pretty much wiped us out. And Jackson told him, I would hunt you down and kill you for what you did. But the fact that you've come to me, I won't arrest you. Nothing. You promise you won't wage war, and you walk out. You leave. And he was like, yeah, I got nothing left. I think his family was killed too. So he left. And for the rest of Weatherford's life and Jackson's life, they actually kept in touch. They wrote letters to each other, and they became as friendly as you could be in that situation, but they never had another negative thing to say about one another. And they were very, in some of the letters, they were very positive towards one another. Like, yeah, you got to do, this, you got to do this, you got to do that. And they even shared tips on planting, because I think Weatherford moved west. And so they shared tips on planting and stuff like that. But stuff like this, I think, should be included in videos like that. Just, because it's also cool. Instead of leaving it like, yep, and then he came to Jackson and that's it. Like, if you don't know it, I get it. But like, I think stuff like that's awesome. Just a little extra.
Jackson was rewarded with promotion to Major General in the regular United States Army and command of the 7th Military District, encompassing Tennessee, the Mississippi Territory, and Louisiana. In August, he imposed the Treaty of Fort Jackson upon the Creek Nation, punishing both loyal White Sticks and hostile Red Sticks alike by forcing them to give up almost 100,000 square kilometres of territory. The Creek War may have been over, but the War of 1812 continued to rage with the British. The defeat and abdication of Emperor Napoleon in France in the spring of 1814 weakened America's diplomatic position and gave Britain the opportunity to focus its war efforts across the Atlantic. That summer, while American and British peace delegations began talks in Ghent in the Low Countries in Europe, Major General Robert Ross landed in Maryland, and on the 24th of August his column entered the American capital of Washington, D.C., and set fire to the city and its government buildings. Not long after this, Jackson marched to Pensacola, Florida, claiming that the Spanish had violated its neutrality after a British naval squadron stopped for repairs. On the 7th of November 1814, Jackson attacked the city, prompting the Spanish to surrender and the British ships to withdraw. A few weeks earlier, Jackson had received a message from New Orleans about the prospect of a British attack on the Louisiana port city. After securing Pensacola, Jackson hurried to New Orleans and arrived on the 1st of December. There, he imposed martial law and took command of the Louisiana militia. Having also formed an alliance with the pirate Jean Lafitte, Jackson had around 5,000 men at his disposal. The British army that sailed to meet him was twice as large, while its commander, General Edward Pakenham, was the famous Duke of Wellington's brother-in-law. On the 23rd of December, the British vanguard landed 6 miles to the south of the city, prompting Jackson to launch a night raid to push it back. Over the next 2 weeks, the two armies prepared for the main showdown, building field fortifications and deploying artillery. Pakenham launched his frontal assault at dawn on the 8th of January 1815. The American artillery cut down ranks of British redcoats as they advanced, and the British soldiers who reached the American ramparts were picked off by the defenders as they attempted to scale the earthen walls. General Pakenham rode forward to rally the 44th Infantry Regiment and was about to lead them into the attack when he was killed by a musket ball. The death of their commander prompted the British to withdraw from the field. From behind their ramparts, Jackson's militiamen lost 13 killed and fewer than 100 total casualties, while the British lost more than 2,000 killed and wounded. When news of Jackson's victory spread across the United States in early February of 1815, the country breathed a collective sigh of relief. The Union was saved, and in the eyes of many Americans, General Andrew Jackson was its savior. He was feted as the country's greatest military commander since George Washington. Around
A lot of the press that he got, the positivity, could have easily went to William Henry Harrison, who, after defeating Tecumseh at the Thames, had some issues with the government, and he resigned. And as soon as he resigned, all the attention then kind of looked around, and boom, Jackson stepped in. It was like a power vacuum, and he just stepped in and took it.
A week later, news arrived that the war had been ended by a treaty signed at Ghent in Europe on the 24th of December 1814. This was 2 weeks before the Battle of New Orleans, but in an age prior to telephones, radios, or any other form of telecommunications, it was weeks before news of the peace agreement reached North America. Britain agreed to restore the Canadian-American border as it had been before the war, while the end of the war with France in Europe had brought to an end many of the naval tensions which had caused the War of 1812 in the first place. At the end of 1815, Jackson was invited to Washington by President Madison, who wished not only to bask in the light of the military hero, but to determine what his political ambitions might be. In due course, Jackson agreed to support James Monroe as the Democratic-Republican candidate in the 1816 election and was named commander of federal troops in the southern half of the United States. In 1816, Jackson turned his attention back to Spanish Florida, which the Seminole tribe used as a base to attack American settlers across the border. While Jackson hoped to put pressure on Spain to deal with the Native American attack, Crawford ordered Jackson to stop Tennesseans from settling on Cherokee land in the northern Mississippi Territory. After Jackson informed Madison that it was impossible to comply with such an order, the president appointed him to a committee to consider the rights of the Cherokees and the Chickasaws to the disputed territory. Since the committee was dominated by whites, they forced the Native Americans to cede the land in exchange for a modest monetary sum. In his correspondence with James Monroe, widely expected to be the next president, Jackson argued that respecting Native American sovereignty would damage the interests and security of the United States, and the best policy towards the Native Americans was to assimilate them into American society. Monroe took office in March 1817. In January 1818, Jackson saw a copy of the War Department's orders to General Edmund Gaines to chase Seminole raiders into Florida, but without attacking Spanish troops or forts.
Edmund P. Gaines, middle name Pendleton, he's a fascinating person. He served under William Henry Harrison. I think it's the Battle of Tippecanoe. He was in the middle of a battle. Excuse, let me get a drink. So, they're in camp. All of a sudden, shots start firing at the camp, hooting and hollering from the tree line. Soldiers are getting around, returning fire. The natives are in the tree line, and they're just unloading on the soldiers in the camp. Edmund P. Gaines stands out and he's walking down, and he's been shot like in his shoulder. He's walking past two men frozen in fear. They don't know what to do. He walks up to him and he's like, "Come on, guys, you got to load your weapons and return fire. Where's the doctor?" And they're like, "Oh, we think he's over there in his tent." He's like, "Okay, return fire. Let's go." He walks to the camp or to the tent, goes in. Like 3 seconds later, I think it was 3 natives round the corner and run into the tent. A gunshot is heard, hooting and hollering, and the tent's banging around on the inside, and these 2 guys are standing there, and they're just watching the outside of this tent, and they're like, oh my goodness, the second in command is going to be brutally murdered. Gaines comes walking out after what seemed like an hour to these guys, but it was like 15 seconds. They heard some gunshots. They heard some, Gaines comes out holding a native by the throat and then throws him down, and the guy's just dead. And Gaines now has a stab wound. He was hit with a tomahawk. He was shot again. And he comes walking towards the 2 guys and he goes, "Let's go. Get into the fight." Walks past them and he's just yelling, "Has anyone seen the doctor?" Man was a savage. They don't make men like that anymore. I mean, they make me, But I'm nowhere near that. He killed 3 people. Fascinating guy.
Jackson believed that the order would merely encourage the Seminoles and other hostile peoples to take refuge in Florida, and in a letter to Monroe, suggested seizing Florida by force instead, a task he estimated would take 60 days to accomplish.
Gaines was also responsible for, I believe, hunting down Aaron Burr after he was deemed to be like a terrorist. He was sent out after him. I want to find some stuff on him because he was a fascinating person.
While Monroe later claimed that he did not see the letter, Jackson claimed that the president had given his assent to his plan. Thus, in early 1818, Jackson rallied his Tennessean volunteers and marched south. In March and April, his army captured several Seminole villages with little resistance, as well as the Spanish settlement of St. Mark's. Then, on his return journey north, he captured Pensacola once again and left it with a garrison of American troops, demonstrating the weakness of Spanish authorities in Florida. Jackson's actions not only infuriated the Spanish, but also the Monroe administration, and he was ordered to relinquish control of the Spanish forts. In 1819, the American Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, and the Spanish ambassador to the U.S., Luis de Onís, signed a treaty whereby Spain ceded Florida to the United States. Not long after the end of the conflict that became known as the First Seminole War, the country was once again hit by a devastating economic crisis known as the Panic of 1819, which resulted from an influx of cheap imports as European industries recovered following the end of the Napoleonic Wars. The crisis was exacerbated when the Bank of the United States stopped lending for land speculation in the West, causing land prices to fall 75%. Government debt continued to increase, and Congress mandated the Monroe administration to cut back its spending on the army. Accordingly, Jackson was cashiered, or retired, as a major general. Monroe did not want to make an enemy out of Jackson and offered him the governorship of Florida after Spain finally decided to ratify the Adams-Onís Treaty. On the 10th of July, Jackson accepted the transfer of authority from Spanish Governor José María Callava. After only a couple of months, Jackson left for home and wrote to Monroe resigning the governorship due to illness. During the early 1820s, Jackson's friends approached him for a run at the presidency in 1824, not so much for his own sake, but to challenge William Crawford, the preferred candidate of former presidents Jefferson and Madison, and therefore regarded as a creature of the Washington establishment. While Jackson indicated that Adams or Calhoun might be in a better position to defeat Crawford, in 1822 he signaled to friends in the Tennessee legislature that he would be prepared to run for president, and at a convention in Pennsylvania in February 1823, he was nominated to run. His rivals for the White House included Monroe's senior cabinet secretaries, Adams and Crawford, as well as Speaker of the House, Henry Clay. Although he did not campaign actively for the presidency, such was his record as a war hero that Jackson received 42% of the popular vote. Jackson won 99 electoral votes to Adams's 84, while Crawford's 41 votes edged out Clay, who only won 37. Since no candidate won a majority of electoral votes, it was up to the House of Representatives to choose among the top 3 finishers. As Speaker, Clay would preside over the election, and while out of the running himself, his support could tip the balance in either Jackson or Adams's favor. The Speaker was no admirer of Adams, but feared that Jackson might become a military dictator. In the winter of 1824,
that he wasn't the only one thinking that, by the way. When he ran, Madison was against it and Jefferson was against it because they thought he's a military guy, he can't be trusted. Which is funny because Washington was a military guy. Now, granted, Washington, completely different character. But Jefferson and Madison, they were politicians. They were not soldiers. What is wrong with you? They weren't soldiers. Monroe was a soldier. Monroe served in, hold on. God damn. Monroe served in the Revolutionary War, was shot in the neck and had an artery severed. And of course he fell and was going to die. And of course the first person that came running up was a doctor who knew exactly what to do. Pinched the arteries and I don't know the surgery procedure back then, but he lived. Spoiler, he lived. But yeah, like he served in the military as well. So I didn't understand the rationale if they only thought that a politician would be good enough to be president. I don't know. I just dislike Jefferson. So, but I hate to be the spoiler here. Jackson does become president. And one of the people he ends up confiding in was James Madison, especially on the South Carolina seceding issue. He did lean towards having conversations with Madison.
Clay met Adams and offered him his support. Hence, when the House cast its ballots on the 9th of February 1825, Adams won 13 states to Jackson's 7 and was duly elected. Within weeks of taking office, President Adams appointed Henry Clay as Secretary of State, an office widely regarded as the stepping stone to the presidency. Jackson's allies claimed that Adams and Clay had struck a corrupt bargain, through which Clay, as Speaker, had delivered Adams the White House, despite Jackson winning far more supporters in the election, and in return, Adams was paving the way for Clay to succeed him as president one day.
I want to correct myself. Jackson talked to Madison, but not about the secession aspect. He spoke to him about constitutional law-related things, and I think secession was on the table. Speaking to him about it, but he was still alive. But he was no, he did. See, I went to Madison's house, and in Madison's house, they have a picture of Jackson sitting at his table, and it was just to show all the people that were there. He did talk to him about the secession. Anyways, maybe I corrected myself, but then I corrected it incorrectly. What?
Consequently, while Jackson returned to his farm in Tennessee after the election, the Jacksonian cause was promoted in Congress by his fellow Tennessean, Senator John Eaton, and Representative Sam Houston, as well as the U.S. Senator Martin Van Buren, who began to form a coalition that would become the basis for the new Democratic Party that would contest the 1828 U.S. presidential election in support of Jackson. In one of the most bitterly contested presidential elections in American history, Jackson's opponents dug into his past to fuel their attacks, including his passion for dueling, his record of disobeying the federal government, his treatment of Native Americans, and his heavy-handed military discipline. Jackson's supporters retaliated by presenting their candidate as the people's champion against the corrupt Washington elite. Ultimately, Adams' supporters failed to prevent Jackson winning the election by a margin of 178 electoral votes to 83. Despite his electoral triumph, Jackson could not help but feel a certain amount of anxiety on behalf of his wife Rachel, who hated the prospect of life in Washington and would find herself subjected to extreme scrutiny. Rachel's anxiety contributed to a heart attack on the 18th of December 1828, and she died 4 days later.
During the whole, I almost said tour, during the whole run-up, John Quincy Adams himself didn't say anything, but it was his lot, his group, whatever you want to say, that were leaving things in the newspaper, basically calling her whore and what was it, like a cheater, because remember from the first video, these two got married before her divorce was pretty much done, and then it wasn't finalized until they had gotten married, and so they went and then they kind of renewed their vows. And I vows, not vowels. I think I almost said vowels. And so there was a lot of bashing on her and her character, and Jackson was not somebody who appreciated that. So she had a heart attack, and then according to the Hermitage, at least when I was there, they don't know if she had another heart attack 4 days later or if it was followed by a stroke, because she survived the heart attack, but she was just in terrible shape, and then she died. And I think he buries her Christmas Eve and makes a comment that, people are like, maybe you should stick around and blah, blah, blah. And he says, the country needs its leader. I'll always mourn, but the country needs to be led. And you think about people who go through traumatic things, like Lincoln losing a child, Jackson losing his wife. What's your name, buddy? Franklin Pierce losing his son in a train accident, getting beheaded in front of him and his wife, and Pierce fell apart. Calvin Coolidge losing his son at the end of his presidential career. You think about all the people, all the presidents that went through things and how differently they handled it. And we're all different, but just how some seem to still just like persevere. They just pushed forward. And others, and I'm not saying that one is better than the other, because we all handle it differently. And I would never want to be in that situation, to lose a son, on the way to the presidency. Pierce turned into a drunk. Lose your wife before you get in there. Lose a kid, lose a son. It's just a terrible thing.
Her heartbroken husband held her so tightly that her body had to be pried from his arms for burial, and the president-elect doubted whether he should go to Washington at all. While he could not escape the conclusion that Rachel's death was a direct consequence of his political ambitions, his sense of duty motivated him to travel to Washington for his inauguration as the 7th President of the United States on the 4th of March, 1829. Jackson gave a brief inaugural address vowing to respect the constitutional limits of his executive power and the rights of the states. As he departed for the White House, the large crowd that had gathered for the opportunity to meet their hero broke the cable restraining them, and the new president had trouble making his way to his new home. Having invited the people into the White House for a reception, Jackson was forced to escape through a side window to his hotel to avoid being overwhelmed. The unedifying spectacle was as sure a sign as any that Andrew Jackson was the people's president. Jackson had fought the 1828 campaign attacking the Adams administration for corruption, and he considered it his duty to root out the federal officials whom he considered part of the anti-democratic Washington elite. For Secretary of State, he appointed Martin Van Buren. As Secretary of the Treasury, he appointed Samuel Ingham of Pennsylvania, and as Secretary of War, he chose his friend from Tennessee, John Eaton. The choice of a protégé for the War Department was an indication that Jackson sought to have personal control of military affairs. As a Washington outsider, Jackson also relied on advice from a small circle of allies, including William Lewis of Tennessee, journalists Amos Kendall of Kentucky and Duff Green from Missouri, and Isaac Hill of New Hampshire, all of whom were induced to stay in Washington with minor government posts. The president's nephew, Andrew Donaldson, served as his secretary and was also part of the so-called Kitchen Cabinet. Jackson claimed that federal officials would perform more effectively if they were not guaranteed their jobs for life, as they effectively had been in the past, but his critics accused him of creating a spoils system to reward his supporters.
I think he fired more people from federal jobs than all of the 6 previous presidents combined. I mean, he came in and was just firing everybody.
The first major crisis of the Jackson presidency had nothing to do with policy, but rather gossiping among society in Washington and...
Is it called the Petticoat Affair? Is this the Petticoat Affair?
Especially the wives of Jackson's cabinet secretaries. On New Year's Day, 1829, the widowed John Eaton married the young Peg O'Neill, whose first husband, a naval officer named John Timberlake, had died by his own hand in 1828. Rumors spread that the newlyweds had been having an affair which drove Timberlake to such drastic action, and after Eaton was named Secretary of War, the wives of Jackson's cabinet secretaries organized a social boycott, led by Floride Calhoun, the wife of Jackson's vice president, John Calhoun. The attacks on Peg Eaton's honor reminded the president of the accusations against his own late wife, and Jackson stood firmly on the side of the Eatons in what became known as the Petticoat Affair. Secretary of State Martin Van Buren, a widower like Jackson, also rallied to Peg Eaton's defense, mobilizing the foreign ambassadors and their wives to call on the Eatons in solidarity. Van Buren's support earned him Jackson's confidence, especially as his nephew and secretary Andrew Donaldson had joined his wife Emily in boycotting the Eatons, an action which led the president to send them back home to Nashville.
Emily Donaldson, side note, she's not at the home of the Hermitage, but they're buried nearby. They had a home. I don't remember the name of it. Really, really sad story with her. She came down with tuberculosis. I don't remember. Don't quote me on that. She came down ill. And Andrew Jackson Donaldson, the nephew who was working with him, wanted to go home because he knew that she was sick. And Jackson kept him. I just need you to do this. I need you to do this. And it had gotten to the point where he knew that she was going, and go from the White House to, Nashville. Not like today, you horse and carriage, it was a while. And so he was in a hurry to leave, and he ended up sticking around for a few extra days to do work for Jackson, and then took off to go home. And by the time he got home, he had found out that his wife had died like that morning, something like that. And what was sad was she knew she was dying. I mean, everyone knew she was dying, but she knew it was getting close. So she was sitting at the bedroom window, sitting on like this little seat. And she was just staring out the bedroom window, waiting to see him rounding this corner on this trail coming up to the house. And she had made a promise to everyone in the house that she would not die. She was 29, that she would not die until she could see her husband again. And unfortunately, she wasn't able to hold out. But she had held out, a mere, 2 extra days. And what I feel bad for is that she wasn't able to be able to have him for those 2 extra days, the last 2 precious days of her life. So it's just a sad story. It's death. It's always sad.
On the 8th of December 1829, Jackson delivered his first annual address to Congress. After starting by discussing some of his plans in foreign policy, including uncharacteristically warm words for Britain, Jackson turned to his domestic agenda. He proposed abolishing the Electoral College so presidents would be elected by popular vote, an arrangement which would have made him president in 1824. Perhaps in response to his opponent's claims that he would be a new Caesar or Bonaparte, he also supported limiting presidents to a single term of up to 6 years.
We're going to go ahead and stop it there. The Confederacy had a 6-year term, one term for 6 years, and I've heard Jimmy Carter and Bill Clinton also say that it would be better because then you don't have to worry, because you do a 4-year term, you get elected, you do 2 years of actual governing, and then it's 2 years of You do 2 years of actual governing, and then 2 years of running for your reelection. And if you get it, great. Now you got your 4 years. So you got your 4 and your 2. So they're like, just make it 6. Makes sense. But I think we're so far along now. This is year 250. 1775 was the battle. So you're working on 250. And I think it's past. I don't think that's going to change at all. I'm going to shut up now. I'm going to end this so that you can, enjoy your day, because you don't want to listen to me continue to talk. But as I say, I'm going to be there on Saturday. It is Tuesday right now, but I'm going to be there Saturday. So I'll make some videos of the Hermitage, and hope you enjoy. But until part 3, have a good day, have a good night.